the Philadelphia Eagles select Jayx Hunt, linebacker, Houston Christian.
Eagles like traits guys. They want guys who are long, explosive.
This is one for new defensive coordinator Vic Fangio.
Right now he has rush potential. He just doesn't have it all together yet. It's going to be a process.
You talk about upside, a little bit of a project, but there is a lot to work with here.
But I like this as a developmental prospect.
Who is Jalyx Hunt? And more importantly, was he worth picking in the 3rd round? We'll discuss that later, but first, let's look at the player that Jalyx Hunt is now, what he needs to improve upon, and how he can fit into the Vic Fangio defense. At the moment, Hunt is a developing player with great physical tools. He has the burst to have one of the quicker first steps, and that shows off when he's closing on quarterbacks at the top of the rush. Although he's just below average in height for the position, he makes up for it with arms that measure in the 80th percentile. His arm length helps him in the run and pass game. In the run game, it helps him when he needs to lock out and shed to make a stop, and in the pass game, it provides a good foundation to develop his pass rush moves. Hunt is a former wide receiver and safety that grew into an edge rusher, and he has been playing the position for only 2 seasons, but you can see the beginnings of his pass rush game plan. He uses a variety of swipes, clubs, and chops to try to beat pass blockers around the edge. He also uses a bull rush that he pairs with a push-pull move to win as well. You often see his arm length on display as he's able to get into the chest of opponents before they can strike him. Like I mentioned, Hunt is a former receiver and safety, and you can see those movement skills show up when he's asked to drop into coverage. And that's part of the reason Vic Fangio was so intrigued by him. When he was drafted, he was announced as a linebacker by the Eagles. Vic Fangio loves manipulating pass protections while keeping an extra defender in coverage by having his outside linebackers drop into coverage on a significant amount of their snaps. Hunt shows good awareness to scan the field before playing off the eyes of the quarterback. With arms as long as selfie sticks, this further enhances his ability to get into throwing windows and also helps when he needs to make a pass breakup at the catch point. In Fangio's defense, will primarily be covering underneath areas in hook zones and in the flats. Offenses will try to exploit a bigger and slower player in space by throwing a lot of screen passes. Again, Hunt's size and length allows him to be disruptive on these plays, overpowering and shedding blocks of smaller receivers and even tight ends aligned out wide. Opposing offensive coordinators try to take advantage of Fangio's willingness to drop his edge rushers into coverage. They will do this by coming out in heavy personnel groupings, where they have more tight ends or running backs on the field and less receivers. This forces the defense to come out in heavier personnel groupings, where they have more linebackers or defensive linemen on the field and less defensive backs. They will then align and spread formations to try to force one of the edge rushers to defend a receiver in space. It's crucial that the Eagles have edge rushers that are willing and able to play in space. Hunt fits that bill. Even if Hunt never becomes a high-end pass rusher, his versatility should allow him to find a place in the league. But the Eagles didn't invest a 3rd-round pick in Hunt just to use him in a pass coverage role. To deem this investment successful, Hunt must develop into a dependable pass rusher. As you'd expect from a player with only 2 years of experience at his position, his technique is still very raw. Like I mentioned, you can see the beginnings of his pass rush game plan, but he needs to improve in a lot of areas. First, he has a bad habit of false stepping that slows his get off. I think a lot of this comes down to not being loaded in his stance. When you slow it down, his first movement is often sinking into an engaged position and then exploding out of his stance. As the ball is snapped, he's often moving down and then forward. He needs to be in that engaged stance before the snap to eliminate the wasted movement and improve his get-off time. Here's an example from Leatu Latu, the first defensive player selected in the 2024 draft. Look how much more tightly he's crouched. He does an excellent job timing the snap, but you can see him sink his hips and load his legs just before the snap, which allows his first movement to be forward as the ball is snapped. Again, we see another example of this. Just before the snap, you can see him sink, load, then explode. In addition, he consistently plays with a high pad level in both the run and pass game. He was able to overwhelm weaker opponents at lower levels, but he isn't going to be NFL offensive linemen playing with bad leverage. He wasn't overpowering people at the Senior Bowl either. One thing that can improve his game greatly is his execution at the top of the rush. On this play, you can see Hunt try to use a jump cross chop, but the tackle is able to get his hand on the V of his neck, which is pretty deep in his chest. And then when Hunt tries to turn the corner at the top of the rush, it takes him an extra couple of steps to gather and turn himself towards the quarterback to pursue. Let's look at Latu again. On his 3rd step, he hops into his move, and as he lands on his 4th step, his hips are already facing the quarterback, and on his 6th step, he's closing on the passer. Let's compare with Hunt. On his third step, he hops into his move, but on his fourth step, his hips are facing up the field. You can see the difference when you look at the still frames side by side. Now, on his sixth step, he's having to turn himself inside, and on his seventh step, he finally starts to head towards the quarterback. But the real trick to this comes from the shoulders. Let's go back to Latu. When he clubs with his left hand, notice how hard he swings his left shoulder around. This does three things. First, it helps him turn his hips to the quarterback. Second, it makes his club more powerful. And third, it helps him get skinny and gives the offensive lineman, who was selected 14th overall, less surface area to grab onto. When we go back to the play with Hunt, by not violently rotating his shoulders when throwing the club, his strike isn't as powerful, and more importantly, it gave the offensive lineman easy access to his chest. Let's look at one more example, this time from new Eagles edge rusher Bryce Huff. Same move from Huff. On the third step, he launches himself, while also violently firing his shoulders through. When he lands, his hips are facing the quarterback, and because of this, he is able to transition to a rip move to not get pushed off his path to the QB. If his hips are facing upfield like we saw from Hunt, he wouldn't be able to rip through, and he would get pushed off his line. On top of improving his ability to time his hands with his feet, Hunt also needs to get better with hand quickness, strike timing, and distance control, as there's a number of reps where his rush gets thrown off track as tackles are able to land punches in his chest. This play is a good example of that and also shows some of the promise Hunt has. As he approaches the tackle, he misjudges the striking range that the tackle has and is late to throw his hands. As a result, he loses power as he tries to jump around the edge. Not to mention, he looks like he's trying to jump off his outside foot instead of his inside one. But as his first move gets thrown off by the punch, he has the awareness to quickly chop down on the tackle's arm. He then follows through with a rip to lift the tackle's outside shoulder and clears his hips through to hunt down the quarterback. His technique to set himself up at the top of the rush will be important because I don't think he has a great ability to bend laterally at his hips and waist. He's a long-legged, high-hipped player, which makes it harder to drop his hips low enough to corner effectively. We can see a couple examples on film where he has tackles beat outside, but because he can't sink and flatten at the top of his rush, he gets pushed up the arc and around the quarterback. I don't see him being in the mold of physical freaks like Myles Garrett, who despite being taller than Hunt, has a freaky ability to drop his hips and bend around the corner. This is also important in the run game. When people talk about having lower pad level and better leverage, a lot of times people are looking up top at the helmet and shoulder pads. These often go together, but the real place you want to have lower leverage is in the hips. Being a high cut player makes it harder to get the leverage needed, and working to consistently sink his hips when taking on run blocks is something Hunt will need to improve on. Since he is a late bloomer, he's still waiting for his strength to catch up to his size. He isn't going to overpower offensive tackles in the NFL, especially with the pad level he plays with currently. And finally, he will be 23 in his rookie season, which is on the older side for a prospect that is considered a multi-year project. Now, was Hunt worth a late third-round pick? He has good physical traits, but let's look back to previous draft classes to put it in perspective. First, how often do edge rushers with comparable athleticism fall to the third round or later? Between 2019 and 2023, of the 88 edge rushers drafted in the third round or later with a relative athletic score, 31% had an RAS score of 9.0 or above. So it's not that uncommon for an athletic edge to fall into the later rounds. When I look at who I think have been the most productive and efficient edge rushers drafted after the third round in that time frame, 4 had an RAS score above 9, 4 below, and 2 with no score. Unsurprisingly, athletic players are generally more likely to succeed than others, but it wasn't a big indication here. College success wasn't much of a predictor either, as many of the top players were on the lower end of sack and pressure rates. For what it's worth, Hunt's pressure rate his final year would have ranked in the 71st percentile, and his sack rate would have ranked in the 77th percentile. You would hope that a third-round edge rusher facing subpar competition would dominate a little bit more. And that's part of what makes Hunt's evaluation so difficult. He's new to the position, so you have to project serious growth in his technique, but he faced competition that was nowhere near as big, athletic, and strong as the players he'll face in the NFL. Is Hunt worth a third-round pick? I guess that comes down to how much risk you would take. The fact is, the majority of players with his profile don't pan out. A lot of third-round picks don't make it anyway, but it's even more difficult to predict when he's a project player that is on the older side and face guys that will be working regular jobs after college. Personally, I felt that there were a number of players left on the board that have a higher likelihood of succeeding in the NFL. However, that's a topic I'll touch on more in my next podcast. But if Hunt does figure it all out, with his physical stature, athletic traits, and versatility, he'll be a home run selection.